My name is Robert. I'm 70 years old, and today I look out the window of my penthouse apartment in Manhattan, watching the city that never sleeps below, with its lights blinking like promises I never kept to myself. I have $23 million in the bank, 3 properties, an investment portfolio that grows even while I sleep, cars I barely drive, and a collection of Swiss watches worth more than most houses in America. But I have no one to have dinner with tonight. No one to call when I wake up in the middle of the night afraid of the approaching death. No one whose face is the last thing I want to see before closing my eyes for the last time. I'm rich, very rich, but I'm still a virgin, and I'm not just talking about the body. I'm talking about the soul, the heart, the life I never truly lived. When I was young, around 18 years old, my father sat me down at the table in our small house in the suburbs of Detroit and told me that life was a race and that those who didn't run would be left behind. He worked at a Ford factory, woke up at 5 in the morning every day, came home with hands dirty with grease and a body broken from exhaustion. I saw my mother stretch every penny, work miracles with little money, saw her wear the same dress at every important event because there were no resources for another. I saw their dignity bow under the weight of bills that never stopped coming. And I swore to myself that night that I would be different, that I would never go through what they went through, that money would never be a problem in my life. I made that vow as if it were a sacred prayer, and I kept every word of it. But the price I paid was greater than any fortune I accumulated. I entered business school on a scholarship I earned by studying 16 hours a day in high school. While my classmates went to parties, dated, lived that golden age of youth where everything seems possible and time seems infinite, I was in the library, always in the library. I remember a girl named Sarah, brown hair that shone under the fluorescent light, a smile that lit up the hallway when she passed by. She tried to talk to me a few times, asked if I wanted to study together, if I was going to the fraternity party on the weekend. I always said no, always had an excuse, always had something more important to do, an exam to study for, a paper to finish, a goal to achieve. I saw disappointment grow in her eyes until it turned into indifference, until one day she stopped trying and started dating a guy from the football team. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had bigger goals, that relationships were distractions for those who didn't have real focus. I graduated at the top of my class, got a position at a consulting firm in New York, and it was like a door to another world opened. I was 22 and already making more money than my father had made in his entire life. I worked 90 hours a week, slept at the office more often than at home, lived on coffee and ambition. My co-workers went out to bars after work, met people, formed connections that went beyond professional. I stayed, always had one more report to review, one more presentation to prepare. The company loved this, they promoted me quickly, gave me generous bonuses, made me feel like I was on the right track. And I was, at least that's what I believed, I was on the path to success, financial security, professional fulfillment. What I didn't know was that I was also on the path to the most absolute loneliness a human being can experience. At 30, I was already a junior partner at the firm. I had an apartment in the Upper East Side, ate at the best restaurants, wore Italian suits that cost the monthly salary of an average worker. Women looked at me, I knew that. They looked at the external signs of success, at the expensive watch, at the polished shoes, at the confidence that money brings. Some tried to approach me, at corporate events, at business dinners, even at the expensive gym where I worked out at 5 in the morning before going to the office. But I didn't know what to do with this attention, didn't know how to talk about things other than work, didn't know how to open my heart because I had closed it so carefully to focus on my career that now I didn't even know where the key was anymore. I made up excuses, said I was too busy, that I had an important meeting, that maybe another time. That other time never came. I remember a woman named Catherine. I met her at a charity gala dinner that my company sponsored. She was a doctor, worked with underprivileged children, had in her eyes a kindness I had never seen before. We talked for hours that night. She made me laugh, a rare thing for me, made me forget for a few moments about the spreadsheets and projections that normally occupied my mind. She gave me her number, said she would love to see me again, maybe for dinner, without all that formality of the event. I put the number in my pocket and said I would call. Weeks passed. The number was forgotten in a drawer. And when I finally thought about calling, so much time had passed that I felt embarrassed, too cowardly to admit I had let the opportunity slip away. Years later, I saw in the newspaper that she had married another doctor. They were opening a clinic together to serve poor communities. I thought about how my life could have been different if I had made that call. At 40, I became a senior partner. My annual income was in the 7 figures. I bought my first Porsche, not because I needed it, but because I could, because it was the kind of thing successful people did. I drove it alone through the streets of Manhattan, feeling the powerful engine purr under my feet. But there was no one in the passenger seat to share that moment, no one to impress except strangers on the street who would never know my name. I started going to a therapist around this time, not because I thought I had a problem, but because successful executives had therapists. It was part of the package. Dr. Morrison asked me in the first session about my personal life, about relationships, about family. I answered by talking about my work, my achievements, my investments. He paused for a long time and asked again, this time slower, more deliberate. "Who do you love, Robert? Who loves you?" I remained silent. The silence stretched for minutes that seemed like hours. Finally, I mumbled something about my parents, who were already elderly by then. He wrote something down in his notebook and changed the subject, but I saw in his eyes something that disturbed me for days, a mixture of pity and concern that I didn't want to acknowledge. My father died when I was 43, a sudden heart attack while watching television. I flew to Detroit for the funeral, saw my mother destroyed by grief, supported by neighbors and friends who had been by their side for decades. At the wake, people took turns telling stories about my father, about how he had helped this or that neighbor, about how he always had a smile and a kind word, about how he and my mother were the example of true love in the community. I realized that my father, the man who worked in a factory and who I had sworn not to be, had lived a much richer life than mine. He had love, he had real friends. He had a wife who looked at him as if he were the most precious thing in the world. I had millions in the bank and was there alone, with no one to hold my hand, no one to comfort except my mother, who already had her own children and grandchildren, my siblings who had built families while I built financial empires. I returned to New York determined to change. I was 43, there was still time. I could still find someone, build something real. I started going out more, accepted invitations to social events, tried to talk to people about things beyond work. But it was like learning a foreign language at 43. Everything seemed forced, artificial. I didn't know how to flirt, didn't know how to read the signals women sent, didn't know how to be vulnerable after spending decades building walls around me. I went on a few dates that friends arranged, awkward dinners where I talked too much about investments and too little about my true self. The women were polite, some were interesting, but there was always a moment where I saw in their eyes that they knew. They knew there was something missing in me, an inability for genuine connection that no amount of money could disguise. I tried dating apps when they started becoming popular. I filled out my profile with professional photos, carefully crafted descriptions that made my life seem interesting and complete. I got matches, chatted with women of all ages, some genuinely interested in what I had to offer. But when it came time to meet in person, I froze. I made up last-minute excuses, cancelled plans, disappeared from conversations. I was afraid, a deep and paralyzing fear of intimacy, of showing who I really was underneath the success and wealth, an empty man who had traded his humanity for digits in a bank account. At 50, I gave up. I simply gave up. I convinced myself that this was how my life would be, that some people were made for professional success and not for love, that I had made my choices and now had to live with them. I dove even deeper into work, accepted positions on boards of directors, invested in startups, traveled the world in first class to meetings that could have been done by video conference. I saw couples in restaurants, in parks, on the subway, and felt a pang of something I didn't want to name, an envy mixed with sadness that I pushed down with more work, more money, more achievements that seemed increasingly empty. My mother passed away when I was 58. Cancer, long and painful. I spent her last months flying from New York to Detroit every week, sitting by her bedside, holding her hand as she wasted away. On one of the last lucid days she had, she looked at me with those eyes that had seen so much, and asked me why I had never brought anyone for her to meet, why I had never married, never allowed myself to be happy the way she and my father were. I tried to give the usual excuses, talk about career, about timing, about not having found the right person. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength for someone so fragile and said I was lying, that I had chosen fear instead of love, that I had wasted the most precious gift God gives us, the ability to love and be loved. She said she forgave me, but that I needed to forgive myself too, that it was never too late to change. She died 3 days later, and her last words kept echoing in my head like a bell that never stops ringing. After the funeral, I returned to my apartment in Manhattan and looked around. Everything was perfect, decorated by an interior designer who cost a fortune, every piece of furniture chosen with care, every artwork on the walls worth more than luxury cars. But it was cold. It was a mausoleum for a man who was still alive. There were no family photos except some old ones of my parents, no signs of life being lived, just money being displayed. I sat on the Italian leather sofa I had never really used and cried for the first time in decades, cried for everything I had lost while making money, cried for the life I could have had and chose not to have. In the years that followed, I tried to fill the void in other ways. I started doing charity work, donated large sums to various causes. My name appeared on plaques at hospitals and libraries. I received invitations to gala events where I was treated as an important benefactor, where people praised me for my generosity. But I knew the truth. I knew I was trying to buy meaning, trying to use money to create connection when I should have used my heart. The people who thanked me at events were polite and kind, but at the end of the night everyone went home with their families, their partners, their real lives, and I returned alone to my empty apartment. I tried hobbies. I learned to play golf, a sport for successful executives. I bought the best equipment, paid for the most exclusive club, hired a private instructor. I played alone most of the time, walking the impeccable green, hitting the ball with technical precision, but without real pleasure. Other players sometimes invited me to complete a foursome. We talked about markets and investments during the game, but it was just another form of networking, another way of doing business disguised as leisure. I bought a yacht, anchored at a marina in Long Island. I spent maybe 10 days on it in 3 years, always alone or with a hired captain who was paid to be my company. Sailing should be liberating, but I just felt more isolated, floating in the ocean the same way I floated through life, without a real destination, without purpose beyond being in motion. I started frequenting expensive restaurants alone, always bringing a book or my tablet to make it seem like I had chosen to be alone, that it wasn't pathetic for a man in his 60s to dine alone night after night. The waiters were always polite, some knew me by name after repeated visits, but I saw the pity in their eyes, the unasked question about why a clearly wealthy man was always alone. There were moments, especially at night, lying in my king-size bed that had never been shared with anyone, where the loneliness was so deep it felt physical, a weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. In those moments, I thought about hiring company, not necessarily sexual, just someone to be there to create the illusion of not being completely alone. But I never did it, had too much pride, or perhaps too much fear of acknowledging how desperate I was. The only real human connections I had were superficial and transactional. My doctor, who saw me for annual checkups increasingly frequent as I aged, my accountant, who managed my growing fortune, my lawyer, who periodically updated my will, a document that left most of my fortune to charitable institutions, since there was no close family to inherit. Sometimes I wondered if these people thought about me when I wasn't present, or if I was just another client, another number on their spreadsheets. I tried to reconnect with old college classmates through social media. I saw their lives through photos and posts, marriages that lasted decades, grown children having their own children, family trips, birthday celebrations surrounded by love. I sent occasional messages, always received with politeness but with a distance that made it clear I was a stranger from the past, not part of their present lives. I had chosen not to cultivate those relationships when it mattered, when we were young and friendships were formed naturally. Now, 40 years later, there was no way to recover the lost time. When I turned 65, I officially retired from the company I had helped build. There was a party, speeches about my contributions, a gold watch that joined the collection of watches I already had. People who worked with me for years hugged me and wished me the best, promised to keep in touch. No one did. I realized that my professional relationships were exactly that, professional, sustained by obligation and convenience, not by genuine affection. Retirement left me with something I had never had before, unlimited time, and no idea what to do with it. I tried to travel more, went to Europe, Asia, South America, always in five-star hotels, always on private tours, always alone. I saw elderly couples holding hands in Paris, families laughing together in Rome, and felt a pain so acute that I had to return to the hotel and lock myself in the room. Travel became torture. Each beautiful place only highlighted the fact that I had no one to share the beauty with. I started going to more doctors, not because I was particularly sick, but because it was human interaction, because it meant someone was paying attention to me, even if they were paid to do so. I developed a mild hypochondria, finding symptoms that justified more appointments, more tests, more reasons to leave the apartment and be in the presence of other human beings, even if in clinical and cold contexts. At 68, I had a minor stroke. Nothing serious, the doctors said, full recovery expected, but a warning from my body that time was running out. I spent 3 days in the hospital, and the nurse who took care of me, a Filipino woman named Maria, was the kindest person to me in years. She held my hand when I was scared, talked to me about her family in the Philippines, showed me pictures of her grandchildren. When I was discharged, I gave her an obscene tip, not because she needed it, but because those 3 days of genuine human care had meant more to me than any deal I had ever closed. I saw the confusion in her eyes when she saw the amount. She tried to refuse, but I insisted. "You need to understand," I said. "You gave me something money can't buy. You made me feel human again, even if just for a few days." The stroke made me think about death more concretely. I started imagining what my funeral would be like, who would come, what they would say. Probably some former colleagues, more out of social obligation than real affection. Maybe some beneficiaries of my charity donations, thanking my generosity but not my person. There would be no devastated widow like my mother was when my father died. There would be no children crying over the loss. There would be no confused grandchildren about why Grandpa won't wake up anymore. There would be an efficient and quick service, an obituary in the newspaper highlighting my professional and philanthropic achievements, and then I would be forgotten, as if I had never really existed. This realization led me to a deep depression. I stopped eating properly, lost weight, stopped shaving regularly. My housekeeper, who came 3 times a week, expressed concern. I dismissed her, didn't want anyone to see me like this, didn't want pity. I spent weeks in the apartment watching the city through the window, watching life happen out there while I just existed inside these expensive walls. It was my doctor who finally intervened, threatened to admit me if I didn't start taking care of myself. I went back to eating, went back to taking care of myself mechanically, but it was just survival, not life. He suggested I seek psychological help again, find a therapist specialized in aging and loneliness issues. I agreed, more to make him stop bothering me than because I believed it would make a difference. The therapist, Dr. Ellen Chen, was different from Dr. Morrison from decades ago. She didn't accept my evasions, didn't let me change the subject when things got uncomfortable. In one of the first sessions, she asked me directly, "Have you ever loved anyone, Robert? Have you ever let anyone in for real?" I tried to talk about my parents, but she interrupted. "No, Robert, I'm talking about romantic love, about intimacy, about vulnerability with another adult. Have you ever experienced that?" The silence that followed was my answer. She then asked something that caught me completely by surprise. "Are you a virgin?" At 68, I had never verbalized this to anyone, never admitted it out loud. But there, in that office with this woman who looked at me without judgment, just with professional curiosity and perhaps a bit of compassion, I said, yes, I'm a virgin. Not just in the physical sense, although that's also true, but virgin of true love, of real connection, of everything that makes life worthwhile. She didn't seem shocked or surprised. She just nodded and asked, "And how does that make you feel?" For the first time in my adult life, I was completely honest about my feelings. I said I felt like a failure, that all my wealth and success seemed like a cruel joke, that I had wasted my life pursuing things that didn't matter. and ignoring the only thing that did. I cried in that session. I cried a lot, and she didn't try to comfort me or tell me everything was okay, just let me feel everything I had repressed for 7 decades. In the following sessions, we began to unpack why I had made the choices I made. We talked about the fear I saw in my parents' eyes when the bills came, about how I interpreted that fear as meaning that money was the most important thing in the world. We talked about how I used work and ambition as a shield against vulnerability, how it was easier to dedicate myself to spreadsheets and presentations than to risk my heart with another human being. We talked about missed opportunities, about Sarah in college, about Catherine at the gala dinner, about countless other moments where I could have chosen differently but didn't. But we also talked about the present and future, about the fact that I was still alive, still had time, could still make different choices. Dr. Chen challenged me. "What do you want, Robert? If you could have anything now, regardless of money, what would it be?" The answer came faster than I expected. I want not to die alone. I want to know what it's like to love someone and be loved back. I want to feel what my parents felt, what my siblings feel, what I saw in the eyes of so many couples throughout my life. I want, even if for a short period of time before I die, to know what it's like to be truly human. She gave me a challenge. Say yes. For the next 6 months, say yes to every opportunity for human connection that appears. Invitation to dinner? Yes. Chance to talk to a stranger? Yes. Opportunity to be vulnerable? Yes. Stop using work, money, or busyness as an excuse. Just say yes and see what happens. It was terrifying. At 69 years old, I had never felt so exposed and unprepared for anything in my life. But I started small steps. I went back to my favorite coffee shop, and instead of sitting alone with my laptop, I sat at the counter and tried to talk to the barista. I discovered he was a literature student, dreamed of writing a novel. We started talking regularly, nothing deep, but it was real human connection, not transactional. I joined a book club at the public library. Me, who had never read fiction because it seemed like a waste of time compared to business books, was sitting in a circle with strangers discussing novels. Initially, it was horrible. I didn't know how to talk about emotions and themes, could only think in terms of narrative efficiency and structure. But with time, I began to understand, began to connect with the stories in a way I had never experienced. I started volunteering at a food bank, physical work that left me tired in a different way from board meetings. I worked alongside people from all social levels, from retirees like me to young college students fulfilling community service hours. We talked while packing food, stories being shared naturally without agenda, without goal beyond human connection. It was through volunteering that I met Helen. She was 64, widowed for 5 years, 3 adult children who lived in other states. She made me laugh with stories about the food bank clients, had a perspective on life that was both pragmatic and hopeful. One day, after volunteering, she asked me if I wanted to get coffee. My instinct was to say no, make up an excuse, run away. But I remembered Dr. Chen's challenge, say yes, so I said yes. That coffee became dinner. That dinner became another dinner. We started seeing each other regularly, and for the first time in my life I was developing what could be called a relationship. Helen knew about my wealth. It was impossible to completely hide. But she didn't seem to care. She was interested in me, in the person underneath the money, and that was both exciting and terrifying. One evening, sitting in a small and cozy Italian restaurant, very different from the Michelin-starred establishments I used to frequent, Helen took my hand across the table and asked me why I always seemed to be holding something back, why I never opened up completely. And there, in that moment, I did something I had never done. I decided to be completely honest. I told her everything, about my life dedicated to work, about all the opportunities for love I wasted, about my virginity, not just physical but emotional, about my fear that it was too late to learn to love, too late to be the person someone could love back. I expected her to pull away, to realize I was too damaged, too old, too inexperienced, but she squeezed my hand tighter and said that we all have our story, that she also had scars and fears, that relationship wasn't about perfection, but about 2 people choosing to try together. She said she admired my courage in being honest, that at 64, She had met enough men to know that vulnerability was rarer and more valuable than money. I started spending more time with Helen, met her children when they came to visit, met her grandchildren. It was strange to be in this family context, like a foreigner learning customs of a new culture. But Helen was patient, her family was welcoming, and slowly I began to understand what I had missed all these years, the wealth that didn't come from bank accounts but from human connections. One night, Helen invited me to stay at her house after dinner. I was 70 years old and was about to have my first intimate experience with another person. I was terrified, hands shaking, mouth dry, ready to make a self-deprecating joke and run away. But Helen held me, looked into my eyes and said there was no rush, no expectations, that we could just lie together if that was all I wanted. And that's what we did that first night, just lying embraced, and it was the most intimate experience of my life until then, feeling the warmth of another human being, hearing her breathing synchronize with mine, realizing I wasn't alone for the first time in 7 decades. With time, our intimacy grew naturally without pressure. And when it finally happened, when I made love for the first time at 70 years old, it wasn't perfect or cinematic. It was clumsy and nervous and full of laughter when things didn't go as planned. But it was real. It was beautiful. It was everything I had imagined and nothing I had imagined at the same time. Helen held me afterwards and said that love wasn't about performance or experience. It was about presence and care. And I was present. I was finally truly present. Now at 70, I look at the last year of my life and see that I lived more in these 12 months than in all the previous 69. Helen isn't perfect. I'm not perfect. Our relationship isn't perfect. We have arguments, we have moments of frustration. We have to navigate the complexity of bringing together 2 lives that were lived separately for so long. But it's real. It's meaningful. It's what my parents had. What I always wanted without knowing I wanted it. I'm still rich. I still have all the material goods I accumulated over decades of obsessive work. But now I know they mean nothing. They're just things, objects I'll leave behind without missing them. What I'll miss when I die, what I'll want to continue, is the love I finally found. If I could go back in time and talk to my 18-year-old self, sitting at that table with my father, hearing about the race of life and how I needed to run faster than everyone, I would say to slow down. I would say that yes, money matters, security matters, but they're not everything. They're not even the most important part. I would say to talk to Sarah, to call Catherine, to say yes to all the opportunities for human connection that would appear over the years. I would say that dying rich and alone is the greatest possible failure, while dying poor but loved is the greatest success. But I can't go back in time. No one can. I can only speak now to those who still have time, to those who are still making choices that will determine what their life will be like in 5, 10, 50 years. And what I say is this: choose love. Always choose love. Choose vulnerability over security. Choose connection over conquest. Choose people over profits. Because in the end, when you're lying in bed knowing the end is near, it's not the numbers in the bank account that bring comfort. It's knowing you truly lived, that you loved and were loved, that you left marks on people's hearts instead of just marks on ledgers. It took me 70 years to learn this, 70 years to understand I was running in the wrong direction all along. I'm lucky to have found Helen, lucky to have these final years with her, however few they are compared to everything I lost. But you who are reading this, you who still have time, you don't need to make my mistakes. You can choose differently. You can choose better. You can choose to live instead of just existing. Time is the only commodity you can't buy, no matter how many millions you have. Once it passes, it doesn't come back, can't be recovered, isn't available for purchase at any price. I wasted almost all my time on Earth pursuing things I now see as absolutely worthless. Don't waste yours. Make the most of every moment. Love without fear. Be vulnerable even when it scares you. Choose people over things, always, in all circumstances. This is my story, the story of a man who had everything and nothing at the same time, who needed to reach 70 years old to finally start living. I hope it's a warning, a lesson, a map showing the wrong path so you can choose the right one. Real success isn't measured in dollars or properties or titles. It's measured in love, in connections, in moments of true human intimacy. And I almost died without knowing any of these. But now I know. I finally know. And Helen is waiting for me for dinner, and that this simple reality of having someone waiting for me is worth more than all the millions I accumulated. Choose better than I chose. Live while there's still time. Love while your heart still beats, because in the end, that's all that really matters.